Years ago, I promised myself that there were two places I was never going to go: California and France. I'm a Midwest boy. Grew up on a farm. I'm used to a little bit of a slower pace. And I've heard that Californians just flat out go all the time, and that sometimes they can be a little weird. Now, if you're from California, I'm sorry. Sorry for you, not for me, but that's a different story. And I've heard that the people in France are not very friendly. Now, in my work as Director of Development for ITEM, I have traveled lots of different places. Last year, covered over 58,000 miles to Indonesia, to India, to Western Canada, Eastern Canada, Northwest Pacific, to Oregon, to Washington, to Iowa, to Michigan, on and on. And you know where else I've been? Yeah, California and France. And I wonder, are there places where maybe you don't like to go? You don't want to go. Maybe it's the inner city. Maybe it's certain states or certain countries. Maybe it's more localized. Maybe it's to a nursing home, a funeral home. Maybe it's to the people across the street from you. Maybe it's to people you're not all that sure about and comfortable with. Maybe it's even to the valley of the shadow of death. There are places that all of us have reservations about going. The disciples had places that they didn't want to go to either. And we're going to find out about one of those in more detail this morning as we look at Mark chapter 5, 1 through 20. So if you haven't already, turn there. It's in your pew Bibles as well, and it's on page 1558. So we'll finish that section and then see what was it that Jesus was wanting to tell his disciples, teach his disciples, as he was taking them to this place. Picking up where we left off, beginning with verse 3 of Mark 5. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. For he had often been bound with shackles and chains, but he wrenched the chains apart, and he broke the shackles in pieces. No one had the strength to subdue him. Night and day among the tombs and on the mountains, he was always crying out and cutting himself with stones. And when he saw Jesus from afar, he ran and fell down before him. And crying out with a loud voice, he said, "What do you have to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I adjure you by God, do not torment me." For he was saying to him, "Come out of the man, you unclean spirit." And Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" He replied, "My name is Legion, for we are many." And he begged him earnestly not to send them out of the country. Now a great herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside, and they begged him, saying, "Send us to the pigs, let us enter them." So he gave them permission, and the unclean spirits came out and entered the pigs. And the herd, numbering about 2,000, rushed down the steep bank into the sea and drowned in the sea. The herdsmen fled and told it in the city and in the country. And people came to see what it was that had happened. And they came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man, the one who had had the legion, sitting there, clothed and in his right mind. And they were afraid. And those who had seen it described to them what had happened to the demon-possessed man and to the pigs. And they began to beg Jesus to depart from their region. As he was getting into the boat, the man who had been possessed with demons begged him that he might go with him. And he did not permit him, but said to him, "Go home to your friends and tell them how much the Lord has done for you and how he has had mercy on you. And he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis how much Jesus had done for him, and everyone marveled. This had been, as we see, a very momentous time for the disciples, a very scary time. They had gone through the storm, a storm unlike anything that they, and many of them were seasoned fishermen, had ever seen before in their lives. And all of a sudden, it comes up, and they're trying to save themselves, and they're getting nowhere. And so they stood, or they said to Jesus, they woke him up. He was sleeping. Don't you care that we're going to perish? Jesus simply stands up, speaks to the wind and to the waves. Peace. Be still. And the waves were as calm as a sheet of glass. And I wonder now if the disciples were not more afraid of the man who was in the boat with them than the waves that had been outside of the boat. And now they continue to go to the southeast portion of the Sea of Galilee. Now, this part of the Sea of Galilee is rimmed by very high limestone bluffs or cliffs. And many in the area had hollowed out holes there for caves in which they were burying their dead. And in that early morning light, as the light is just beginning to come up, I wonder if those holes dug into the sides of those hills maybe didn't resemble a little bit the eye sockets in a skull. And then as they land, this man comes screaming at them at the top of his lungs. And I'm sure the disciples were wondering, what is going on here? Why are we here? Why do we have to come here overnight? What is it here that Jesus wants? Well, we learned a number of truths here, and the main thing that we're learning is that Jesus is not limited. I appreciated what Ben had to say about that you can't limit Jesus as the light of the world. And they were about to learn a number of things about Jesus. That Jesus is not limited in that there is no place where he will not go. No place where Jesus will not go. He's not limited by that. And the disciples had begun to learn that little by little because Jesus was taking them to places that they didn't really want to go. They didn't like the Gentiles. They didn't like the Samaritans. Here Jesus is taking them into an area in the Decapolis which is primarily occupied by Gentiles, and good Jews simply didn't go there very often. They didn't like the Samaritans, and Jesus takes them through Samaria. They didn't necessarily like the sick and others, but Jesus kept taking them to these places and these people. And they were slowly learning that if they wanted to follow Jesus, they had to go where he was going, even if they didn't want to go. Jesus wasn't put off by those things. Jesus was going steadfastly to Jerusalem, where he was going to die. And the disciples knew that. When they got word that Lazarus had died near Jerusalem, they didn't want to go. But finally, Thomas stands up and says, well, let's go with him and die. Nobody wants to go to a place where they think they're going to die. Jesus goes steadfastly to the cross. Jesus goes to his enemies who he knows will reject him, who will despise him, who will beat him, who will persecute him. He goes to the cross alone. And there on the cross, he faces the wrath of God against the sin of the world laid upon him. He goes to the tomb. The disciples beginning to understand that if they're going to follow Jesus, they're going to have to go where Jesus goes. Most of us don't like to go to those places. We don't like to go to scary places. We don't like to go to places where we don't know what to expect. We don't like to go to new places. We don't like to be surprised. And we especially don't like to go alone. As I'm traveling more and more, I'm finding the wonderfulness of having somebody else go with me as I travel these distances so that I'm not alone. But Jesus told the disciples in the Great Commission, go into all the world except France and California. And you can fill in the blanks. The problem is there are no blanks. He says, go into all the world. And when we're hesitant about that, we need to remember the last part of that Great Commission, lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the world. And we need to remember that when Jesus calls us into those scary places, those lonely places, those places where it feels like we're going alone. We're not. He is going with us. There is no place where Jesus will not go. And we need to take that to heart. So why is it that there are no places where Jesus will not go? It's because there's no person that Jesus won't reach out to. Now think about this demoniac. This man, and there's no other way to put it, this man was a mess. He was a psychological mess. He was a physical mess. He had continually hurt himself, scraping himself, sores and cuts and everything, bruises all over the place. He was naked. He was psychologically a broken man. He was crazy. Sociologically a broken man. Nobody wanted to be around him anymore. This was a man who, in every sense of the word, was truly messed up. Now, what do we think about that? What do we know about that? Well, there's a lot of people who are messed up and broken, aren't there? The disciples, like all people, avoided the lepers because they were messy people. And yet Jesus went to the lepers and touched them. The disciples didn't like being around sick people, but Jesus would head straight to them. The disciples weren't comfortable being around needy people, for example, who were hungry. They wanted to send them home. Jesus reached out to them. The disciples didn't like being around people that they disagreed with. They wanted to call fire down on the Samaritans. Jesus went there to reach out to the Samaritans and to love them. Are there people that you and I hesitate to reach out to, that we're not comfortable around? Maybe people that we just don't like. Liberals, homosexuals, lesbians, homeless people, dirty people, lazy people, people that are always complaining and whining, people who get angry a lot, maybe people who are just hard to be around. You have any people like that in your life? People just hard to be around? And we want to avoid them. About 7 years ago, I met a man, or first I'd heard of this man. He was a pastor in the United Church of Christ. I don't know how many of you know about that denomination, but it's probably a church that's in the forefront of every liberal parade that there is. And I had heard that this man was extremely liberal and outspoken about it. And it seemed like God was impressing on me to meet this man, and I didn't want to go meet him. What for? But God kept pressing that on my mind, and so I called him up, asked him if he would meet me for lunch, and we met for lunch. And he began to pour out his heart to me. His wife had left him a number of times, come back, but was never really comfortable with the family. He was extremely concerned about the people in his congregation. And as he unfolded his story, I began to realize here is a man who is broken like I am broken. Here is a man who needs Jesus the way I need Jesus. Here is a man who needs God's grace just like I need God's grace. And this is a man who's become a friend. And this is a man who I try to pray for regularly. He doesn't know the Lord yet, as far as I can tell, but he seems to want to know him and serve him. There are a lot of messy people in our lives and in our world, but Jesus reaches out to them. And the third thing that we see here is that there is no power that Jesus won't overcome. This man was what he was who he was, because he was inhabited by demons, by 5,000 to 6,000 of them. That's what the word legion means in Latin. 5,000 to 6,000 demons inhabiting him, tormenting him, persecuting him. Now, when I say demons, don't think of them as these cute little devils with, little horns and that. Think nasty, ugly, destructive, frightening creatures. Think a little bit like the orcs in Lord of the Rings. Think of the Joker in The Dark Knight. Creatures bent on destroying others. And now you have a picture of what this man's life and situation is like. Impossible to reach. Everybody had written him off. But Jesus goes specifically to this place for him. Why? Because there's no power that Jesus cannot overcome. And the demons knew that. They knew God was sovereign. They knew Jesus was sovereign. Do we? Do we believe that he's sovereign? Do we believe that he's able to overcome the messiness in people's lives? I think we believe that, yes, Christ is able, his grace is sovereign when it comes to justification. But I'm not sure that we believe that Jesus is sovereign when it comes to the sanctification of people, that he can clean people up. In spite of all the things in their lives, in spite of all the dirtiness in their lives, can he really change and transform people? I think that's one of the reasons why we often don't reach out to other people, because we look at their lives and say, well, even if he became a Christian, he is a mess. I don't think he would fit in our church. Where would he go? What would I do with him? And so we write people off. We rule them out of the kingdom because they are such a huge project, and we can't imagine that they can possibly change. I don't know if you've seen this T-shirt that you sometimes see around evangelism taking place. The T-shirt says, "Become a fisher of men. You catch them, Jesus will clean them." Well, I don't like that, because we don't catch them even. Christ is the one who catches them. He is the one who cleans them up and prepares them for the kingdom. There is no power that Jesus cannot overcome. He is not limited by those things. I could tell you the story in detail, but I'll try to summarize it real quickly. A couple of years ago, there was a liberal, lesbian college professor in Syracuse who decided that she was going to write an expose about a Christian group called Promise Keepers. Maybe you remember about that group years ago. And she began to write articles in the newspaper. And in one of those articles, a pastor from a PCA church in the community wrote back to her, but wrote to her in such a way that she was intrigued by how he wrote, how he was writing in a caring, understanding fashion. And so she responded back to him. They invited her to dinner. They got to know each other. They were praying for her. They were welcoming her, loving her. And to make the long story short, she decided, well, you know, if I'm going to expose these Christians, maybe I ought to read the Bible, as I think that's got something to do with them and how they become Christians. So she read the Bible a number of times. And then she began to think, you know, maybe I ought to go meet some of them. And she started coming to this pastor's church. And she found there broken people like herself, but people who were reaching out to her and genuinely welcoming her. And she became a believer. And she changed her life. No, she didn't change her lifestyle. Jesus began to change her lifestyle. Because you see, there's also no peace that God won't give. Let me ask you, do you know any messy people? Do you? If you don't, let me ask you another question. Why not? The woods are full of them. Your neighborhood is full of them. Your family is probably full of them. The people at work are full of them. There are messy people all around. But God reaches out to them. And that's because there is no peace that Jesus cannot give. Look again at this man. If you read verses 15 through and 16, you notice how 15 describes the man's change. He was clothed and in his right mind. Why is that detail given? There's no detail in Scripture that's not there for a reason. He was clothed. Well, obviously that would have meant that he was now wearing clothes, where before he was completely naked. He probably got those clothes from the disciples. But I think it means more than that. He was now clothed with the righteousness of Jesus Christ as well. So often when we look at people outwardly and we think they need to change, we're thinking of outward changes. The only change that needs to happen is the inward change of our hearts, our wicked hearts, being clothed by Christ's righteousness. And that's what makes everyone acceptable to God. Not our political beliefs, not our lifestyle, not our hard work, or any of those things. It is only if we're clothed in the righteousness of Jesus Christ. And then it says he was in his right mind. He could now think clearly and see clearly. He was now at peace with God. And that leads me to ask you a tough question. Are you at peace with God? Do you understand that apart from Christ's righteousness, apart from our faith in Jesus' obedience and death, we have no hope. And there's nothing else that we can depend on but the righteousness of Jesus. And have you asked, have you admitted that to God yourself? And really understood what that means? And have you come to Christ naked and recognizing that you're spiritually naked and ask him to clothe you with what Christ has done? And that's the only thing your hope is in. Only then can you and I have peace with God. And when we begin to have that peace with God, then we can be at peace with ourselves and at peace with those around us, as this man was beginning to see happening in his life. Jesus was transforming him. And I think sometimes because we see the mess in other people's lives and we don't see the changes quickly, and we don't always see the changes in ourselves very quickly, we're doubtful that he can make those changes. Why doesn't God, through Christ, change us like that? Well, it's too hard on us, for one thing. And I think if he did, we would become pretty prideful and say, well, why can't those people change? I changed. Here, Jesus does this quickly. Why? Because I think he and the disciples were only going to spend a short few moments with this man, and he wanted the disciples to see the power of transformation that comes through Jesus Christ. And so it was so quickly. Most of the time, it's not. Most of the time, it's quiet. But it happens because there is no peace that Jesus cannot give. And then look at one more transformation in verses 18 through 20 as it talks about this man. Here is the one who had feared Jesus, now has faith in him. Here is the one whom Jesus has switched the control of his life from being that under demons to now being delivered from them. Before he feared and avoided people, now Jesus is going to send him to people. He is a changed man with a changed mission. And Jesus is going to use him to spread this good news that Jesus is not limited. The last thing we see here is that there is no person that Jesus cannot use. And that includes you and me. I think sometimes we are hesitant about sharing the gospel because of ourselves. We rule ourselves out. We think of the things in our own life. We think of the things in the past. We think of the things that even now aren't the way they should be completely. And we're wondering if God can use us. We look at our limitations. And maybe you think to yourself, well, I could share the gospel if I could talk the way Pastor Rob talks. And if I knew all the answers to the questions that I'm afraid people are going to ask, if I knew them the way Pastor Rob knows them, or the way the elders know them, or the way Ben knows them, then I could do that. And so we rule ourselves out of reaching out to others the way this man did. And this man did. You notice it mentions about the Decapolis. Recently, in the last 10, 20 years, archaeologists have begun to discover ruin upon ruin of churches all throughout the Decapolis area, in that southeast area around Jerusalem. We have no record from the Bible of Jesus or the disciples ever going back there again. So how come there's so many churches there? How did those people find out about Jesus? Could it be that it was through this man whom Jesus had called and sent to his friends and his family and told him to tell them the marvelous things that God had done in their lives? Could it be that they came to know Jesus from this demoniac? When I graduated from high school, we all kind of went our separate ways. And I remember there was a young man in our class who was, like many young men, not confident in his speaking ability, shy. He didn't speak up in class very much because he would get his tongue